If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified.
53 days of silence, no arrest, no named suspect, no answers, just a grainy doorbell camera image of a masked figure. And a mother's family standing in front of news cameras, pleading with a stranger they have never met to please come forward. This is the Nancy Guthrie true crime case, and it has rattled Tucson and Arizona in a way this city has not felt in decades. On the morning of March 24th, a single headline cracked through that silence. FBI analysis discovers new breakthrough in Nancy Guthrie case. In true crime, the word breakthrough gets thrown around so often it has nearly lost all meaning. A tip comes in. Breakthrough. A neighbor talks. Breakthrough. A camera catches a shadow. Breakthrough. The media prints it. The public waits. Nobody gets arrested. The cycle resets. But this one was different. Because buried inside a local Tucson broadcast, one day before that headline ran, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down for an interview and said something that no law enforcement official in this entire investigation had ever said publicly before.
That this individual, with or without the backpack, was at that house on January 11th.
He said something that tells you the FBI is no longer just collecting pieces. They are building towards something. And the person who walked into Nancy Guthrie's home that night left something behind that cannot be taken back. Stay with this documentary, because by the time this narration is done, you will understand exactly why. On March the 23rd, one day before that headline ran, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down with local Tucson station KOL and said this on record in a direct broadcast interview.
On the 11th, and that's with the FBI's analysis of the equipment and digital stuff they've done.
I do believe that something occurred on January 11th. And that's with the FBI's analysis of the equipment and digital stuff they've done. Read that again slowly. That is not a tip. That is not a theory circulating in a true crime forum at 2 in the morning. That is not a lead that came through the public tip line. That is a county sheriff on camera confirming that the FBI ran their own independent forensic analysis of the digital equipment at Nancy Guthrie's property. And that analysis produced a specific belief about a specific date, 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie was taken. Now, before this documentary goes any further, it is worth pausing on what the word breakthrough actually means inside an active investigation. Because it does not mean what most headlines want you to think it means. A breakthrough is not an arrest. It is not a named suspect. It is not a case solved. In law enforcement terms, a breakthrough is a material shift in the investigative picture. Think of it this way. Investigators have been working a puzzle with thousands of pieces for 53 days. A breakthrough is not the completed picture. It is the moment they find the corner piece, the one that tells them what shape they are actually working with. Before that piece, everything is relative. After it, the picture begins to hold still. For 53 days, this investigation had been running without a single publicly confirmed anchor date before the night Nancy Guthrie was taken. No prior contact established on record. No confirmed date for a prior visit to the property. The FBI had received more than 19,000 tips. A full-time dedicated task force. 5 Pima County Sheriff's Department officers working alongside multiple FBI agents assigned exclusively to this case since early March. And across all of that effort, not one law enforcement official had gone on record to say that something specific happened before the night she was taken, until March 23rd. That is what changed, and that's exactly why it matters. Here's where this true crime case takes a turn that most people missed entirely. The day before Sheriff Nanos gave that interview, on March 21st, the Guthrie family released a public statement through Tucson's special broadcast covering Nancy's disappearance.
Outpouring from neighbors, friends, and the people of Tucson. We are all family now. We continue to believe it is Tucsonans and the greater Southern Arizona community that hold the key to finding resolution in this case. Someone knows something. It's possible a member of this community has information that they do not even realize is significant. We hope people search their memories, especially around the key timelines of January 31st and the early morning hours of February 1st, as well as the late evening of January 11th. We desperately ask this community for renewed attention to our mom's case. Please consult camera footage, Journal notes, text messages, observations, or conversations that in retrospect may hold significance. No detail is too small. It may be the key. We miss our mom with every breath, and we cannot be in peace until she is home. We cannot grieve. We can only ache and wonder. Our focus is solely on finding her and bringing her home. We want to celebrate her beautiful and courageous life, but we cannot do that until she is brought to a final place of rest. Thank you for continuing to pray without ceasing. The Guthrie family. Cameron and Christine. Annie.
Inside that statement, the family made a specific and unusual appeal. They did not ask the Tucson community to simply think back to January 31st or the early morning hours of February 1st, the documented night of the abduction. They specifically asked people to search their memories around the late evening of January 11th. That is not a coincidence. That is coordination. Families in active investigations do not drop specific dates into public statements without guidance from the investigators working the case. The Guthrie family would not have pointed the public toward January 11th unless law enforcement told them that date needed fresh attention. The family statement and the Nanos interview are not two separate developments. They are the same development, announced in sequence over 2 days, both pointing at the exact same date. Now consider the reward structure sitting on top of all of this. The Guthrie family has offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's safe recovery. The FBI independently put up $100,000 for information leading to a location or an arrest. Tucson Crime Stoppers added $12,500 through its fund. That is more than $1.2 million combined. One of the largest publicly announced reward packages in any missing persons case in recent Arizona history. And as of this recording, it remains unclaimed. Nobody who knows something has stepped forward to collect it. Sheriff Nanos was asked directly whether he believed this kind of crime could happen again in Tucson. His answer was not a reassurance. He said, "Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you're safe. No. Keep your wits about you."
And so it'd be silly to tell people, yeah, don't worry about it. You're not his target. Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you're safe. No, keep your wits about you.
That is a top law enforcement official telling the people of Tucson that whoever did this is still out there, still free, still unidentified, and in a true crime documentary, those words land with full weight. Because they were not spoken for effect, they were spoken because they are true. When the FBI released images from Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera on February 10th, 2026, the public saw one version of this masked figure. A man in a full balaclava, a jacket, long pants, gloves, and a front holster carrying what appeared to be a handgun. He was also carrying a 25-liter Ozark trail hiker backpack. The FBI described him as approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall with an average build. And in the footage, he moved directly toward that front door camera, methodically, deliberately, reached for it and covered it. That is the image most people associate with the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. But the FBI released more than one image. In a second photograph, the same masked figure appears at the property. Same general build, same balaclava, but no backpack, no visible weapon, no tactical gear. The figure is simply there, present at the property, but with nothing in hand. A source with direct knowledge of the investigation confirmed to Fox News Digital that one of those doorbell images was taken on a different day from the others, indicating the masked suspect may have visited the home in advance of the February 1st abduction. The Pima County Sheriff's Department responded after that report and acknowledged the released images show the suspect in different stages of attire, including with and without a backpack, but emphasized that no official date or timestamp had been confirmed for any of the images. Their written statement read that any suggestion the photographs were taken on different days was purely speculative. Sheriff Nanos echoed that directly, telling NBC News it was all speculative for anyone to suggest that second photo came from a different day. And that is exactly where things stood for weeks. The image without the backpack generated enormous public interest in true crime circles about a possible prior visit to the property. But without an official timestamp, nothing could be confirmed. Then January 11th entered the conversation. And everything that had been called speculative stopped being speculative. In mid-March, NBC News reported that FBI agents had returned to the neighborhood surrounding Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina Foothills, and this time, they were not canvassing broadly. They were not asking residents for general observations about unusual activity in January. They were asking about one particular evening.
Two specific dates. January 11th, which is something that I've reported before, that I've heard from other neighbors, but also January 24th, which is the Saturday before Nancy Guthrie went missing.
January 11th. Agents went door to door and asked neighbors to pull their own camera footage from that particular night and think carefully about anything they remembered seeing. That level of precision of a single date in a neighborhood that had already been canvassed extensively does not come from guesswork. It comes from something the investigation already held. What it came from was the Nest camera data. When Sheriff Nanos explained the January 11th focus to NBC News on March 22nd, he said Google had initially flagged the image of the suspect without. The backpack is potentially originating from January 11th. On that basis, investigators began examining that date as a possible prior visit to the property. Neighbors were asked to review their footage. The Guthrie family was informed of its significance. Then Google walked it back. The company told authorities it could not definitively confirm that the image was from January 11th or from any specific date at all. As Nanos put it directly, Google initially reported that date as a possibility, then later retracted the statement. That is where this investigation would have hit a wall. Except it did not, because the following day, on March the 23rd, Nanos did not step back from January 11th. He stepped forward. His exact words on KOL were these.
It occurred on the 11th, and that's with the FBI's analysis of the equipment and digital stuff they've done.
I do believe that something occurred on January 11th, and that's with the FBI's analysis of the equipment and digital stuff they've done. Not Google's analysis. The FBI's. Two entirely separate examinations of the same evidence. Google analyzed. Its cloud metadata arrived at January 11th, then retreated from the claim. The FBI conducted an independent forensic analysis of the Nest camera hardware itself, and arrived at the same date, and has not retreated. One analysis pulled back, the other stands. Now think about what January 11th actually means in behavioral terms, because this is where this true crime case shifts from digital forensics into something far more unsettling. If the FBI's conclusion is correct, someone stood at Nancy Guthrie's front door 3 weeks before the night they came back to take her. No weapon, no tactical gear, no backpack loaded with equipment, just presence, watching, learning the property, testing what the camera captured, understanding what the neighborhood looked like at that hour of the night. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendafer, writing publicly on her verified social media account on March 22nd, 2026, described that visit as what she believed was a trial run, a reconnaissance, mission conducted before the actual operation. She also noted that the moon was in a waning crescent phase on January 11th, while February 1st fell on a full moon. That is her analytical observation drawn from public record, not a confirmed law enforcement finding, but it is the kind of detail that reflects serious investigative thinking about behavioral patterns, because a crime of this precision does not emerge from impulse, the targeted nature that Nanos himself has described, the disabling of the camera, the tactical equipment, the knowledge of the property layout. None of that happens without planning. And a prior visit 3 weeks before the abduction means the planning window is longer and far more calculated than anyone initially understood. A longer planning window means more exposure, more movements, more potential witnesses, more moments where this person was somewhere they can be placed. And if they were standing at that property on January 11th, they may have left something behind that night too. On February 19th, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed what investigators had been working to establish since the first days of this case.
I think from day one, we had some strong beliefs about what happened, and those beliefs haven't diminished.
Do you believe it was a burglary gone wrong?
I'm not going to get into those theories. We have our beliefs. Everybody else has theirs.
Unknown DNA, genetic material belonging to neither Nancy Guthrie nor anyone known to have had regular close contact with her, had been found inside her home. Nanos said investigators believed it could belong to the suspect. Then he named the complication directly. The sample was mixed. In forensic terms, a mixed DNA sample contains genetic material from more than one person. This is more common than most people realize. When a suspect moves through a space that someone has lived in for years, touching surfaces that others have also touched, moving through rooms that carry a history of contact, genetic material overlaps. Disentangling one person's contribution from within that mixture requires an additional analytical step. Bioinformatics scientists must isolate and extract the suspect's genetic profile from the combined sample before it can be submitted to any identification database. It takes longer. It requires a higher level of precision. And Nanos was transparent about the timeline. Results could take weeks, months, or, in the most difficult scenario, up to a year. Separately, a glove was recovered from a roadside location approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. It appeared to match the type visible on the suspect in the FBI-released footage. The glove's DNA was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national criminal database containing approximately 22 million profiles. The result came back with no match. Further analysis ultimately traced the glove's DNA to a nearby restaurant worker with no connection to the investigation. That finding eliminated the glove as a direct evidential link to the suspect. The DNA found inside Nancy Guthrie's home remains the central biological evidence in this case. CeCe Moore is the chief forensic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based laboratory that has helped investigators solve more than 300 cases using DNA evidence alone. She is among the most widely cited experts in this field in the country. When the mixed DNA finding was announced in February 2026, her public response was not discouragement. It was calibrated, reasoned confidence. Speaking to the Today Show, she said the lab has had success with mixture cases before, but that it simply requires one extra step after the profile is created. Bioinformatics scientists must work on that file to extract the suspect's DNA out from the mixture before the genetic genealogy process can begin.
We have successfully worked a lot of mixture cases in investigative genetic genealogy. So initially I wasn't too concerned about it because you can sometimes have very straightforward mixtures where you have the victim's DNA and the perpetrator's DNA, and it's not difficult to deconvolute that, to separate out the perpetrator's DNA that you're trying to identify.
She added that the location of the unknown DNA inside the home made her extremely hopeful, because its placement at the scene makes it far more likely that it can be definitively tied to whoever took Nancy Guthrie. Moore also offered a specific theory about how the suspect may have deposited DNA without realizing it. The FBI release footage shows what analysts have described as a bite flashlight, a flashlight held in the mouth to free both hands while the suspect worked at Nancy's front door. Moore pointed out that a person cannot hold an object in their mouth for an uninterrupted period. At some point it comes out. When it does, saliva transfers to the gloves, and when those gloved hands touch any surface inside the home, any door, any wall, any object, DNA follows. As careful as this person was, Moore said publicly, the moment that flashlight left his mouth, his DNA was on the outside of that glove, and he had to have touched something. In March 2026, Moore went further. Speaking on a News Nation podcast, she recommended that investigators return to Nancy's home and conduct an additional round of forensic swabbing, accounting for time elapsed and the fact that the home had since been accessed by family members. Her recommendation was specific. She said she would still go back and re-swab parts of that house and look for even a rootless hair, because modern forensic analysis can extract a full genetic profile from that level of material alone. Her exact words were direct. We have solved cases with really old DNA. DNA is actually pretty hardy, and if they have not yet collected his DNA, it is still at that crime scene somewhere. 300 successfully resolved cases. That is the foundation behind that statement. And in this true crime investigation, that foundation matters enormously because of what comes next. Once a usable DNA profile is extracted from crime scene evidence, investigators can upload it to a genealogy database. The two databases currently available for law enforcement use are GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, platforms where private citizens have voluntarily submitted their own DNA, primarily for personal ancestry research, and both of which allow law enforcement access through opt-in agreement. Together they contain fewer than 2 million profiles. The analysis searches for partial DNA matches, not the suspect directly, but people who share some genetic material with them. Distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, family members the suspect has likely never met. From those partial matches, forensic genealogists build a family tree, working backward through ancestry records, birth records, marriage records, and census data, until that tree narrows to a single individual whose physical profile and geographic location align with what the investigation has already established. That process has a name. investigative genetic genealogy. And in the true crime world, it has a defining moment. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, a retired police officer from Northern California who committed at least 13 murders and dozens of violent crimes across the state over multiple decades. CODIS had his genetic profile associated with dozens of crime scenes and produced 0 matches, because he had never been convicted of anything requiring his submission to the database. He believed he was untouchable. When investigators uploaded his crime scene DNA to GED match, partial matches surfaced to distant relatives. Forensic genealogists built a family tree that eventually narrowed to one individual fitting the physical description and geographic range of the crimes. Investigators followed DeAngelo to a Hobby Lobby store, swabbed his car door handle when he stepped away, and later retrieved a tissue from his trash. Both samples matched the crime scene DNA. He was arrested in April 2018, decades after his first crime. He later pleaded guilty and is serving multiple life sentences. Then there was Brian Kohberger, the man who murdered 4 University of Idaho students in November 2022. DNA from a knife sheath left at the crime scene was run through the same investigative genetic genealogy process. The analysis took slightly longer than usual because Kohberger's ancestry included recent immigrant roots from Italy, which reduced the number of useful family connections available in the databases, but it still worked. He was arrested less than 2 months after those murders. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that investigators are actively exploring investigative genetic genealogy options. A federal law enforcement source separately told CBS News that investigators would be checking commercial DNA databases beyond CODIS. The speed of that process depends heavily on one variable, the suspect's ancestry. Moore explained publicly that if the suspect has deep roots in the United States with primarily Northwestern European ancestry, a partial match in the available databases could surface within minutes or hours. But if the suspect's ancestry runs through Latin America with immigrant roots in recent generations, the available profiles thin considerably, and the process can extend to weeks, months, or longer. That variable carries specific weight in this case. Tucson, Arizona sits within 12 miles of the Mexican border. The FBI's Phoenix field office is coordinated with authorities on both sides of that border as part of standard investigative protocol. Whether the suspect's ancestry is directly affecting the pace of the DNA analysis is something law enforcement has not confirmed publicly. What CeCe Moore has confirmed publicly, on record, it's her conclusion about the eventual outcome. Speaking to the Today Show in February, she did not hedge.
If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now, because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified.
She did not say might. She said this: if I was the person who took Nancy Guthrie, I would be extremely concerned right now, because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified. Will, not might, not could, will. While forensic analysts were reaching conclusions about January 11th, a separate line of inquiry was developing on the ground in the Catalina Foothills. And the specificity of what federal agents were asking tells you everything about where this investigation was heading. NewsNation correspondent Brian Enton, who had been reporting from the Tucson area throughout this entire case, confirmed through sources in mid-March that FBI agents had returned to the neighborhood surrounding Nancy Guthrie's home. Not for the first time, but again. And this time they came back with far more granular questions than before. The first thing they were asking about was a property in the neighborhood that had been vacated shortly before Nancy's disappearance. A neighbor had moved out. Agents were going door to door asking residents what they knew about that individual and the circumstances of that departure. Enton was careful to note that investigators were not suggesting the vacant property was directly connected to the crime.
There's one neighbor that moved out before Nancy disappeared, and they have been asking more questions about that situation.
But in a true crime case, where every thread points to advanced planning and deep local knowledge, a neighbor who left the area in close proximity to the abduction is a variable that cannot be set aside without examination. Retired Pima County SWAT Commander Bob Crayer provided context for exactly why empty properties matter in cases with this level of operational preparation. A vacated home gives someone familiar with a neighborhood a potential observation point, a place to monitor activity, study the routines of the street, and move without drawing a single moment of attention. The person who came to Nancy Guthrie's front door on February 1st knew where that camera was, knew what time of night to move, knew how to disable the device immediately upon arrival. That knowledge came from somewhere, and agents are methodically building the map of exactly how it was obtained. The second thing the FBI was asking about was construction workers, and the precision of that request is what makes it significant. Agents were not asking residents for general observations about unfamiliar vehicles or unusual activity. They were asking for names, the full names of every contractor and every worker active on construction projects in the neighborhood in the days and weeks leading up to February 1st.
And then also, and this I found to be particularly interesting, they are asking about, there's several houses that are under construction in the neighborhood, and they are asking specifically for names of contractors and workers who were working in the neighborhood on those houses, on those construction projects. And I'm talking about like specifics, like they...
Enton reported that a resident told him a friend whose home was under active construction at the time was approached by FBI agents and asked to hand over the complete list of everyone who had worked on that project. A separate social media reporter shared consistent information in March 2026 that FBI agents had made multiple visits to a construction site near the streets, adjacent to Nancy's home, interviewed workers there, checked the structures on the property, and walked the site entirely. Former FBI agent Steve Moore explained to News Nation what that level of operational specificity actually means. Agents asking for individual construction worker names is not a sign that the investigation is running low on options. It is the Bureau building a roster, a fully accountable list of every person with a legitimate physical presence in that neighborhood during the critical window before February 1st. Construction workers on active job sites have a reason to be on a residential street for hours at a stretch without drawing concern. They have direct sight lines to neighboring properties. Nobody questions a work truck parked along a Catalina Foothills street in the early morning hours. If someone was conducting surveillance of Nancy Guthrie's home in the weeks before the abduction while maintaining a credible reason to be present in that neighborhood, a construction crew roster is precisely the population the FBI needs to work through, eliminate, or identify. Then there is El Charro Cafe. In October 2025, The Today Show filmed a segment featuring Savannah Guthrie returning to Tucson, her hometown. The filming took place on October 17, 2025, and the segment aired nationally in November 2025, less than 3 months before Nancy was taken. El Charro Cafe, which has operated continuously at its downtown Tucson location since 1922 and holds the distinction of being the oldest continuously family-owned Mexican restaurant in the United States, was the final stop of that segment. Savannah sat down at El Charro with Nancy and her sister Annie. They shared a meal on camera. It was broadcast to millions of people across the country. After Nancy's disappearance, it was watched again by millions more. A source told media outlets there was significant internal reflection at a Mycena NBC about whether that segment had inadvertently placed a target on Nancy Guthrie. By publicly broadcasting her face, her connection to a famous daughter, and her presence in Tucson before a national audience. According to Enton's reporting, FBI agents visited El Charro and questioned staff members about the day of filming. They asked whether anyone at the restaurant had seemed out of place during the shoot, anyone who wanted to take photographs of the crew, anyone who lingered, anyone who acted in a way that stood out. The restaurant's president, Ray Flores, told the Tucson Daily Star that as of that point he had not been personally contacted by investigators. Whether subsequent contact was made has not been publicly resolved, but what the El Charro angle establishes, regardless of that specific detail, is the investigative framework driving every one of these threads. The FBI is constructing a complete account of Nancy Guthrie's public footprint in the months before she was taken, tracking every documented location where someone watching from a distance could have identified her, studied her, and begun planning. The construction worker roster, the vacant property, the nationally broadcast restaurant visit. The common thread running through all of it is the same central question that this entire investigation is built around. How did whoever took Nancy Guthrie come to know enough about her life, her home, and her neighborhood to plan this with the level of precision it required? The answer to that question is what investigators are assembling, name by name, address by address, frame by frame. What the FBI has called a breakthrough is not a single discovery. It is the intersection of several investigative threads that have been developing simultaneously for weeks, and are now pointing in the same direction. The FBI's independent forensic analysis of the Nest camera hardware produced a sustained conclusion that something occurred at Nancy Guthrie's property on January 11th. Google's own metadata analysis flagged that same date before walking it back. The Guthrie family publicly appealed to the Tucson community for attention to that specific evening. And Sheriff Nanos confirmed the FBI's belief on record in a direct broadcast interview on March 23, 2026. That is not a rumor. That is not a leak from an anonymous source. That is the county sheriff going on camera with an investigative conclusion. The FBI reached through its own independent forensic work. The unknown DNA found inside the Octui home is being processed through the exact same methodology that put Joseph D'Angelo behind bars, after decades of freedom, and identified Brian Kohberger within weeks. CeCe Moore, the leading public expert on investigative genetic genealogy in this country, has said publicly and on record that the person who left that DNA will be identified. Not might be, will be. The analysis is actively running. The FBI has the names of construction workers active in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood in the weeks before February 1st. They are asking pointed questions about a neighbor who vacated the area before Nancy disappeared. They have been methodically working backward through her publicly documented footprint to trace exactly how someone targeted her with this level of precision. And the forensic team underlying all of it, the same team that pulled surveillance footage from a camera that the standard system had already marked for deletion, is the same team that conducted the independent equipment analysis, producing the sustained conclusion about January 11th. These are not separate stories running parallel to each other. They are the same story converging. What remains unknown is precise. No suspect has been named. No arrest has been made. Sheriff Nanos said publicly on KOL, and these words matter. We have so much in front of us, and we believe we have good evidence in front of us. Will that dry up? Could I be wrong? Absolutely. Anything is possible, but we are not giving up. In a separate NBC News interview, he added, "Right now, everything is speculative. We do not have anything in front of us that says this is who did this and this is why." Those two statements are not contradictions. They are an honest picture of exactly where this investigation stands. There is good evidence. There is no named suspect. There is a date, January 11th, that the FBI's own forensic work has confirmed. There is DNA under active genetic genealogy analysis. There is a neighborhood grid being mapped down to individual worker names. And there is a forensic clock running on technology that has brought down people who believed they were permanently beyond identification. Attorney Chad Cummings, speaking to Front Page Detectives in March 2026, outlined the three scenarios that could explain why no public arrest has been made, despite weeks of intensive investigation. Either the FBI has already identified someone and is building the case to a prosecutable standard before moving. The investigation has run into complications connected to the suspect's identity or associations, or investigators have not yet closed in on a specific individual. The structure of what law enforcement has released publicly, the careful confirmations of specific investigative beliefs, the sustained focus on a single prior date, the stated confidence that strong evidence exists, is more consistent with the first scenario than with an investigation running without direction. Retired FBI Special Agent Greg Rogers told Parade in March 2026, "I am confident there's a good amount of research underway concerning the DNA samples found in the residence. There will not be any press releases concerning the if and until a potential suspect is identified. No press releases until there is something to put in one." The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Anyone with information from the late evening of January 11th, from the night of January 31st, or from the early morning hours of February 1st is asked to contact investigators directly. No detail is considered too small. Every name, every memory, every piece of footage from those dates is still relevant. The evidence is active. The case is not cold. And the person who walked into Nancy Guthrie's home that night left something behind that forensic science is still working to surface. This true crime documentary will be here when it does.